So, talked about daily well-being and resilience. We're going to talk about thriving, which really has to do with connectedness. So connectedness to meaning and purpose, connectedness to God, and generally speaking, ministry leaders have a really high sense of purpose in life, in their work, and a sense of connection to God. It's the connection to other people. It's that isolation piece that we have to think about together in some key kinds of ways. So I want to use a metaphor for you for the kinds of relationships that we're finding flourishing pastors tend to practice and have built into their lives. But I want to share one of my all-time favorite stories, ministry stories, with you to get into this. So because of my dad's career in music ministry, I've been to more what I call off-Broadway church productions than I can possibly remember. And this is my all-time favorite story. Funniest things happen in church, don't they? And so this was a Easter musical. My dad had written a whole cantata for choir and orchestra and drama and the whole 9 yards. And this mega church in Texas decided they wanted it to be the premiere of this Easter musical. So I was in high school at the time, and my brother was as well, so we flew to Texas to this premiere. And this was a large church, a lot of resources, so they had drama ministry department with semi-professional actors and makeup and costumes and the whole thing. And they had this special prop for the crucifixion scene, which they were reenacting, that was a spear, and the tip of this spear was actually made out of rubber. It looked metal, but it was made out of rubber, and it would retract down into the shaft of the spear when you pressed it against the side of the actor who was playing the part of Christ. And so it looked like it really, penetrated the side of Christ, and they had like some fake blood under some makeup on his, abdomen, so it looked kind of real. All went well in rehearsal, but unfortunately somebody got the props mixed up backstage for the real performance. So they get to that part of the story. The Roman centurion does his thing, and the guy playing the part of Jesus screams out from the cross, "Oh my God, they really stabbed me." Yes.
They have like gun wranglers on set. You have to do like knife wranglers.
Right. Which is not part of the script, right? So they take him down off the cross, rush him to the ER because he's got like vital organs pierced or something. He ended up being fine, by the way. We found out later. But the show must go on, so there's more. So there was an understudy. There was a second string Jesus, apparently. But he was like 60, 70 pounds heavier than the first guy, so it looked like post-resurrection Jesus suddenly put on a bunch of weight, But then they get to the very end, and I don't know if any of you have ever saw, and this is not used in churches as much, but there was this material called scrim that used to be used. It's like a sheer netting kind of a thing, and if you backlight it, it becomes translucent, and so you could turn the lights out, do scene changes, then backlight it, And so they had this whole platform set up on a pulley system behind scrim with a smoke machine to reenact the ascension at the end of the story, right? So they get to that part of the story, Jesus stands on the platform, they drop the weight for the pulleys, which was the weight for the first Jesus, so nothing happens. So like for an awkwardly long period of time, Jesus is like waiting to ascend, just kind of standing there. So they panic backstage, tying a bunch more weight. It's too much weight. It shoots up really fast, shoots him to the ceiling and knocks him out, and they have to take him to the hospital. This is a true story. So my brother and I were like, what was it like to work in that ER? We got two guys dressed like Jesus in here. Like, what's going on? So funny things happen in church, and the metaphor I want to give to you that's right. Yeah, the liability issues in that one are significant, and you've traumatized your entire congregation somehow. Is the metaphor of a stage. And if I don't know a lot about acting, but when we say that there's been a great performance in a movie or in a play, there's something authentic about that person, the actor, that is coming across somehow congruently through that role, and we connect with that, and that's what we say was a great, front stage performance. And in a similar kind of way, a lot of what you do that people know about is on the front stage. You're in a public role, you're preaching, you're teaching, you're marrying people, burying people, leading. And so there's some ways to think about those front stage relationships that are helpful. But we also need a backstage as ministry leaders. What happens on the backstage? You rehearse, prepare for the front stage, you debrief the front stage, you laugh about the funny things that happen, you can vent about the things that are frustrating, have other people that are involved in the behind the scenes that understand what it's like, what the demands of that front stage are like. And then we all need an off stage. And so I want to talk with you about what I mean by these three, and then I'm going to let you talk at your tables for a minute. Again, it's important to recognize allies in ministry, those people that will share the front stage. They're on board with your leadership. They're on board with the mission of the church. They're the people that get there early to set up chairs and stay late to help clean up. You know the kind of people I'm talking about that every church needs. They're allies in ministry. They may not necessarily be personal confidants of yours, nor should they necessarily be. And I get the question a lot, should I have close friends in my congregation? Well, I never say no to that, because in one way that would be silly, because that's where you spend most of your time. On the other hand, there is a power differential in that relationship, no matter how you slice it. You are in a pastoral role. And the way people relate to you, as we discussed, many pastors have had the experience of thinking they could trust someone as a personal confidant, only to find out that person really couldn't handle seeing them as a person. And so that what was shared in confidence shows up as a prayer request or at a board meeting or some such thing, and then pastors feel really burned and hurt. So use discernment there. I think you'll find over time the people that seem to have really healthy boundaries, that can handle seeing you as a person and being in more of a friendship, personal friendship over time. The people that you're on your first Sunday come up to you and say, Pastor, when you need a day off, call me. When you don't want to work, you just want to hang out. That person's going to be work all day long, right? That there's some kind of need they're wanting to get met by you. That is probably not a need that you can meet for them. And so to use discernment around those kind of boundaries is important. But backstage, who shares your backstage? Other pastoral staff. That may or may not be the case in your context. You may be the only actual person with a title of pastor or paid staff. But if you have a multi-staff situation, you kind of have a bit of that built into your life as a backstage. Denominational leaders or whoever you report to in whatever system that you're in, if you report to anybody, having a mutually supportive relationship with that superior is important for flourishing. Now, I know that's a two-way street. I get that. You can only control your half of that. But what's so fascinating to me is what would you guess is the number one predictor of job satisfaction in America right now across every kind of job? Anyone want to take a guess? It's not pay, surprisingly. Trust. Yeah. Does my supervisor treat me as a person? Isn't that fascinating? It's not pay or benefits. Those matter. But the number one thing is the relationship with the person that is in power. And do they see me as a human being and treat me as such?
Can you repeat that? It's the number one what?
Predictor of job satisfaction in America. Yeah. Yeah. And some of that we see in the Great Resignation. So I don't know if you've been out to a restaurant recently where they didn't have enough staff, so they don't seat the whole restaurant, right? Was that last night? Okay. Oh, that's right. We did have yeah. So the question is, what are people doing that were doing those jobs? And what the research is saying is that most of those people decided to become entrepreneurial, do something. They didn't want to have to answer to somebody anymore. They were tired of being mistreated. And so during COVID, they gave people time to kind of reevaluate, and they're like, I'm gonna try to do my own thing because I wasn't being treated with respect and mutual support, that kind of thing. Having a mentor at every stage of our development is important. especially in the early stages of ministry leadership, the first 5 to 7 years of being in a pastoral role, but even beyond that, having somebody that you connect with who's a bit ahead of you in the journey in some way can be enormously helpful. A wise guide is another way to look at that. But the big one I want to talk about is the community of practice, which is what's happening this week at a gathering like this, and what happens through Manna is having a community of practice, other people that do what you do, that get your world. You don't have to explain when you walk into this room what it's like to be a church planter. You all just know, right? And there's something really important about that. What we find, though, is that pastors tend to not get together with their own guild, if you will, or profession nearly as much as other helping professions hang out with their own kind. So physicians hanging out with physicians, therapists with therapists, social workers with social workers, lawyers with lawyers. I like to say because nobody else will hang out with lawyers. My cousin who's a lawyer doesn't think that's very funny. But why do you think that might be the case? Why do we not do this as much as other helping professions get together with their own profession? Anybody have a thought about that?
We're terribly insecure.
Say more.
So we don't want to see the more successful pastor
Yeah.
of the church.
Yeah.
So it reminds of us
Yeah.
our inadequacies.
Yeah. It's so hard sometimes to know, am I making a difference? How do you even measure that? That it's kind of like going on Facebook and you see everybody's highlights, right? And think, well, my life must be terrible because their life looks fantastic. Well, you're only seeing their vacation pictures. You're not seeing, Monday morning, the kids screaming as they're getting ready to go to school or whatever. But a similar thing can happen. So the sense of competition, that's the first thing pastors say when I ask that question. Some of it's time and the time demands on pastors. But what we're finding is if you can find a group of people, doesn't necessarily have to be from your same tribe or denomination. Sometimes it's easier if it's not actually, because you don't have to worry about them becoming your bishop or your superintendent or whatever in the future. Finding a place to really be truly real and vulnerable and authentic and accountable is enormously life-giving. And I have seen this happen. You probably have too. It takes time, just like any other set of relationships, but it is possible to get past those insecurity pieces and the competition, and it can be enormously life-giving. What happens is we shy away from that and then cut ourselves off from something that could be incredibly life-giving and break that sense of isolation of being on an island, that kind of thing. So really important to find that community of practice. Manna certainly serves that purpose to some degree or a large degree, and Charlie or I can help you find that if you need to find that in some way. And we all need an offstage. When and where and with whom do you get to just be a person? I got asked to speak pre-COVID to a very large gathering of pastors' wives in Canada. And when I first told my wife about the invitation, she laughed, which didn't give me a lot of confidence about saying yes to the experience. But we talked about it, and I decided to do it. Most nervous I've been in a long time, right? Stand-up is like 400 or 500 women. What do I know about anything? And they were very kind. We had a good time. This woman came up to me at the break in tears, and she said, I just want to share my story and have you share it wherever you want. I'm filing for divorce next week after 37 years of marriage. My husband, the pastor, has insisted our entire married life on being called pastor at home by me and our children, and now our grandchildren. And I'm done. Now, I know it's an extreme story. It's a true story. But he could not step out of the role, even in his own marriage, to just be a guy, just be a husband, just be a father. And because of what psychologists call role immersion, being immersed in a role 24/7, which you are probably unlike any other role there is, you have to find places to just be a person. Now, certainly that happens in a healthy marriage where there's true two-way intimacy. We can get good at one-way intimacy as pastors and therapists. People are sharing all their stuff with us all the time, right? Where are you sharing all of it? That shouldn't necessarily be from the pulpit, right? But it needs to be shared somewhere. And in a healthy marriage, we feel truly known, naked and unashamed in every sense. And that deep intimacy is what sustains us and all these other complex relationships we navigate, those family relationships. But beyond that, having a close personal friendship, I recommend outside of your congregation. Why do I say that? Because they're not in that relational system. And they're not primarily relating to you as your role. They're relating to you just as Chris, just as Charlie. You can just be a friend. Now, they know you're a pastor, they believe in that, support you in that, want to hear about that, but you don't have to be their pastor. You can just be a friend. Hugely important. And what I often see is that when pastors are really in those moderate to severe stages of burnout, is there's an underdeveloped backstage and offstage. They just haven't paid attention to those over time. And so really want to encourage you toward that. Now, I know you only have so much time and energy for relationships. I get that. But this is what we're finding, that the pastors that are flourishing over the long haul are intentional about having a well-developed, supportive front stage, a backstage, and an offstage. I'll give you a quick example of an offstage. I teach this material in a 2-week Doctor of Ministry class at Fuller every couple of years. So you can consider yourselves as having a D-Min by the end of today, I guess. And this incredibly gifted woman, pastor of a large Lutheran, senior pastor of a large Lutheran church, told me that she got into cycling as a hobby and joined the cycling club and got to be friends with people. And it was 3 years before anybody ever asked her, "What do you do?" And so then she told them, and they all freaked out, right? But by then, the friendships were developed enough, it didn't matter. So she can still just be herself and enjoy that detachment, that hobby, and get exercise at the same time and spend some time with people who aren't Christians and share her faith. And she said, that has been incredibly life-giving to me. I don't have to be on in the same way, that I always have to be mindful of how I respond and what the way I'm presenting myself and all of that. And to just be fully and spontaneously yourself somewhere is important. Make sense? I think I saw a hand earlier. Yeah.
Someone else can go first.
Did you have your hand up earlier?
Yeah, I was just gonna say two things. First, maybe calling us pastor is maybe the problem. Maybe like calling us by name might make it a little bit easier for people to just see us as people.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a
Yeah.
bad thing.
If you want them to call you your holiness or something like that, that might be distancing. Yeah.
The second thing for me, I feel like I'm myself anyways
Mm-hmm.
with everybody, whether I'm with our church
Mhm.
or outside. I might be more aware of what I say,
Mm-hmm.
depending on how mature the person is, and that's just to protect them.
Sure.
But that I do that with everyone,
Mm-hmm.
not just people from church.
Yeah.
Even I kind of gauge who I'm around. That's
Sure.
kind of emotional, just intelligence.
Right.
But I don't feel like I have I'm not a pastor hat on it. I stopped that a long time ago.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad
I think it's a healthy. I mean, where we can get into trouble is when there's a persona that we put on that that isn't authentic and true self, and we keep that maintained, but that's not really who we are, and that's where people get into dangerous territory. So yeah, you want to be the same person, but there are different levels of self-disclosure and intimacy probably in each one of these areas. For various reasons, not the least of which is protecting the person involved. So that's absolutely part of it. Yeah. Does that answer your question? It's a great question. Yeah.
What about the
Yeah.
calling someone a pastor? Because in
Yeah.
church planting, like where we did our training, they will tell you, everybody calls you pastor. If they don't call you pastor, so and so, you correct them.
Yeah.
It's not Gabriella, it's Pastor Gabriella.
Yeah.
Like that's the training we took.
Yeah.
We don't really do that because
Sure.
Like, what if they don't see
Yeah.
it as their pastor?
Yeah.
You know? And it's not like a title thing, but that's how they say it. They say it is so that everybody can see, out of respect for the culture, this is
Yeah.
what you're doing. But I honestly see that the people that don't call me pastor are a lot more open with
Yeah.
me than the ones that do.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So I think it depends on the person who is the pastor and your context and the ecclesiology and polities and theology of a particular church, for example. Right now I'm doing a directed study with a Catholic priest of a very large Catholic church, and wonderful guy, hilarious sense of humor. And the first time we met, he showed up in my office. He was like in shorts and a t-shirt and flip-flops. And I'm calling him Father in his first name. And he finally said, just call me my first name. He said, this is my day off. You're not part of my parish. You're a professor. I just need to be me here. And it was helpful to me to know how he preferred to do that. And so now we just do that. And it's just two guys talking about theology, basically. And so it depends, I think. And, if a leader has too much of a need to be called a certain title, then that's probably a concern or red flag for me, But there are different traditions. So, any of you ever heard of Bishop Kenneth Ulmer? South Central Bible Church, huge church that used to own the Forum where the Lakers play. He's become a friend, amazing guy, my favorite preacher of all time. Everybody calls him Bishop. Even his kids call him Bishop. And it's somewhat of a term of endearment, but it's also a respect thing. And so there's also that you are in a pastoral role, and so what's the appropriate role to take, an appropriate way to relate to people based on that role, and it kind of depends on personal preference, I think. You don't want to be too informal in the sense that nobody's then going to respect you. On the other hand, you can be so formal or needing that title so much that that's a little concerning too. But it's a good question. Yeah.
So the lady who's filed for divorce, I'm assuming there's a lot more behind that versus just, he says, call me pastor 24/7.
Well, yeah. I mean, that was just a symptom of just a lack of intimacy,
Yeah.
and that the church was, and this happens often, the church was functioning like an affair, essentially. I mean, it was the thing that always got his primary time and attention and energy. Yeah. And she just felt like she didn't even know him because he just wouldn't let anybody in, including her. So, yeah, there was a lot behind that. But I think that was the symptom of the much larger issue. Does that make sense? Yeah. Other comments, questions? So I want to give you about 5 minutes for the sake of our time, just to talk at your tables about your front stage, backstage, and off stage, and where might God be calling you to be a little more intentional in a strategic support system, which everybody in your line of work needs, for sure. Make sense? So go for it, and then we'll talk about authenticity and bring the plane in for a landing. All right, how we doing? One of the other things I'll just mention to you, and you'd probably expect a psychologist to say this, one of the most helpful backstage or offstage, some people can be in more than one category too, the same person, depends on who they are, but having a therapist, I think every pastor should have a therapist. Not because I think pastors are all psychologically jacked up and stuff, but just a place to process all that comes at you and all the complexity. Somewhere you don't have to worry about caring for them. They're there to care for you, and they understand emotional processes and stuff. And so if that's something you need and want, and I'm sure Charlie has resources, or I can help get you connected there. I do have kind of my own private vetted list of people that I know work well with pastors, which is not every Christian therapist. So some Christian therapists have their own church wounds and are still working through their own authority issues, and actually don't work well with clergy because they've never been a pastor. They don't understand it from the inside. And so you need somebody that's going to get it, that has some expertise and experience and that kind of thing. So if I can help you with that, let me know. So I want to talk about authenticity briefly as we close here. Let's skip that part. So what we've discovered is the key to long-term flourishing is developing and sustaining what we call a positive pastoral identity, which is to say a positive sense of myself in this very complex role. Now, we think this takes some time to form. This is why mentoring is so important in that first 5 to 7 years of experience. A similar thing happens for other professions. So if you were to talk to your doctor and ask them, did you feel like a doctor the moment you graduated from medical school? Most of them would probably say no, yes and no. It took some years of practicing medicine till I had a sense of being a physician as an identity and a sense of competence and enough mastery to say, yes, I am a doctor, I'm a physician. Similar thing happens for therapists and psychologists, other kinds of professions, and for clergy too. We think it takes at least 5 to 7 years of experiencing yourself in the role to develop that sense of positive pastoral identity or not. And what we're finding is that that early tone can set a long-term trajectory. One of my grandmothers used to say to me, be careful which rut you choose because you'll be in it for a long time. You ever heard that phrase before? It's a reference to the wagon trains that would come from the East Coast to the West Coast. You can still see the wagon ruts in certain parts of the Southwest where wagon after wagon followed one another and it actually dug like tracks in the ground. So once you put your wagon in that rut, you were in that path until you got to California, basically. And we're finding something like that seems to be the case for people that on the front end didn't have the mentoring or the positive experience to form a positive sense of themselves in this very complex role. Unless there's a reparative experience, they tend to not flourish long term. They tend to sort of flounder in a way. Now, what makes this difficult, besides everything we've already talked about, is the role complexity for clergy. You have the most complex job description that exists. I can back that up with this research. We did our own, and then we also commissioned another what's called job analysis of pastors. And this has only been done with rigorous research methodology, I think 3 times that I know of, with similar results. This is where personnel psychologists will get exemplars together, so we get a room of people just like you together, and we would say to you, okay, church planters, what are the hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly tasks you have to do this job well? What are the areas of knowledge and skill and ability and competencies that are needed in order to do all those tasks? And then we would analyze that across many, many people and come up with categories of core competencies that a person would need in order to do a particular kind of job. Everybody with me? So the first researcher that did this has done this for every conceivable profession, including NASA astronauts and all kinds of cool stuff. And he came back to us and said, I am dumbfounded. Who would ever try this? This is impossible. The breadth of competencies, he came up with 65 clusters of core competencies a person would need to be a pastor. And these are the macro categories. So just look at the breadth of this. You need to be an expert counselor, expert administrator, teacher, scholar, evangelist, spiritual guide, preacher, reformer, priest, musician. And, administrator probably includes things like fixing the church plumbing when nobody else is around, right? Some of you have done that. Nobody trained you to do that. You didn't know you were going to be doing that. And yet you YouTube it and go to Home Depot and there you are. Save the church some money. It's the breadth of competencies and switching rapidly between those in any given day that is unlike any other job in terms of what that requires of a person, the demands that puts on a person. I've got a great email I should have called up from a family friend of mine who's a pastor who wrote me this great email about this, and he said, this literally happened to me on a Monday, and he went down the list of what happened. He went to the hospital to celebrate with a family as they had a baby and welcome a newborn baby into the world. Literally went down the hall in the same hospital to help withdraw life support from a loved one who was brain dead for another family in the span of 2 hours. I mean, you talk about emotional extremes, right? Then rushed back to the church, did some sermon prep, met with a premarital couple who are so in love, and isn't it so great? We've never had a disagreement. Isn't that wonderful? That's not wonderful, by the way. It's not realistic, right? Followed by a married couple who are on the verge of divorce, who can't stand each other anymore. Then a board meeting that evening with, he says, high-powered CEOs who think he should be more of a CEO than a shepherd, who are wealthy, used to being the most powerful person in the room wherever they go, and they bring that to church. And then he went out to the car, and there was a homeless person in need on the way to the car. And that was Monday. And that's not all that unusual, is it, for people in full-time ministry? Now, there's a positive side to that, in that what the research suggests on jobs is that people don't want a job that doesn't challenge them, believe it or not, because we get bored. So even in places that are manufacturing plants and stuff, they're doing more to switch it up for people. So they're not doing the same repetitive task all day long, 8 hours a day, every day, but they move people around to different things because we just get bored. And if it's challenging and there's variety, it calls the best out of us, we grow, that kind of thing. But at a certain point, it's too much variety. It's too much demand. And this is where a lot of pastors find themselves. And so we can go one of two directions with that. We can tell ourselves, okay, I need to focus and get better and be great at everything. And we tend to focus on what we're not very good at. We're kind of socialized that way. If you grow up in the States anyway, and your math is behind in elementary school, what happens? You get a math tutor, and that's appropriate for that age. But sometimes we can take that into leadership, and what we now know from the strengths positive psych research is you can put time and energy into what you're not very good at, and you will get improvement. You'll get incremental improvement. Bit by bit, you will get better. However, if you took that same time and energy and put it into developing what you're naturally strong and gifted and passionate about, you will get exponential growth, not just incremental growth. Doesn't mean you ignore your shadow side or the things that are underdeveloped, but lead out of your strengths at least 60% of the time seems to be the threshold over the course of time. If it dips too far below that for too long, people withdraw from their work, they burn out more quickly. So there's this notion of what's called job crafting. If we had time, I would have you get your calendars out, and for the last 3, even 6 months, go through your calendar and add up what you've spent doing what in ministry by category over time. And when I do that with a group of pastors, almost inevitably, people are surprised by how much time they're doing certain things they didn't realize they were spending that much time doing. I didn't realize I was spending 4 hours a day answering email. I don't want to be doing that. Or I'm spending a lot of my time outside of things that are my core passions, gifts, strengths, and maybe there's a way to invite someone else who loves to, that's their core strength. For example, I didn't get any financial training at all in graduate school, even with a PhD, and spreadsheets just are not my thing. I have to do them because we have grants, I have a budget at a university. My administrative operations person, her name is Shantae, lives for spreadsheets. I mean, it is like, just give her a spreadsheet and she is in her happy place. That's a really great partnership, right? So I still oversee it, she keeps me in the loop. Have at it, knock yourself out, right? Have a ball with spreadsheets. Not my thing. Now, I know that's a luxury sometimes. If you're, the only solo pastor at a church plant, you don't necessarily have that luxury right off the bat. But as soon as you can, to start faceting the role around job craft around your strengths and passions and start to delegate, put complementary strengths around you and approach it as a team is just a much more sustainable way to go, regardless of the size of church, by the way. Approaching things as a team is much more sustainable. And what we're finding is the goodness of fit around not just your capabilities and your personality characteristics, but actually your core convictions. There's a values piece here. And again, this is where you have an advantage, I think, in some ways as a church planter. What do you care most about in your own personal theology? Sometimes what happens when churches call a pastor, when a pastor accepts a church, is they see a certain gift, like, oh, they preach without notes, that's our pastor. And that's the only criteria they're really thinking about. They're not thinking about these layers of fit. And we get 2 years in and realize what the pastor most values theologically is not what that church really values. But we didn't talk about that on the front end. And so now we realize we're on a very different page about what we're doing here. And we can either reconcile that or not. I was talking to an alum recently from APU, interviewing for a youth ministry position, and he's very passionate, like a lot of Gen Z students, for all the right reasons about social justice, just phenomenally gifted in thinking about that stuff. And he's interviewing at a church, and I happen to know some of the history of the church that really doesn't care about social justice. They should, obviously, but they don't. And they really don't care to learn to care about social justice. That's going to be a tough fit for him because of that initial values conversation is so far apart. Does that make sense? And so thinking through these layers of fit is really important. And you get to shape that around your strengths. You get to create a culture around your strengths and convictions in a way that going into an established church is maybe a little more difficult. But this goodness of fit is a big deal. So here's what we can do in this authenticity quadrant to live into that true self God has created for us to become. First thing, cultivating self-acceptance. Dr. Bloom, who created this research, talks about pastors who are flourishing have what he calls a quiet self, meaning they're confident, appropriately confident in their strengths. It's not pride, by the way, if it's accurate. Pride is the overinflated, inaccurate self-appraisal. But if I know I'm a good preacher and I feel confident in that, that can become prideful if I'm not careful, but that's not necessarily prideful. You with me? I want to leverage that strength strategically for the sake of the mission of this church and the work of the kingdom, and put people around me with complementary strengths. But I have to come to a place of self-acceptance and come to terms with the stuff I'm not great at and be okay with that. And find a fit where at least 60% of the time I'm able to lead out of my strengths and my authenticity. Doesn't mean there aren't going to be whole days where you're spending time doing stuff that's totally outside of your job description or gifts or even anything you remotely like doing. I get that. But coming to terms with accepting yourself. Yes, I'm good at these things. I'm not so great at these things. Let me think about the implications of that for the sake of the church, because it's about the church. It's not about me. It involves me as a leader, but that quiet self piece is authentic humility, which I think is something more like self-acceptance, where I see myself fairly accurately and accept myself with my gifts and my liabilities. And I'm also a part of a research project looking at humility in clergy. And we realized quickly, we're actually studying narcissism as well, but we can't tell pastors that or they won't participate in the research. But a true narcissist will actually brag to you about their humility, believe it or not. So if you're bragging about your humility, do you really have authentic humility? Probably not. It's the pastors that have that quiet self, what we call double humility. They're not really aware that they're humble. But the church is the primary focus, not their own ego needs, not their own emotional needs in some inappropriate kind of way. You get the picture. Clarify your role around your strengths. We talked about that. This one is our recent finding that's fascinating to me. We started talking about joy at the very beginning, if you remember. And what we're finding that as a daily practice, at the end of your workday, whenever that comes, and I know that's not at 5 o'clock necessarily for pastors, it could be 8 o'clock, could be midnight, for at least 15, 20 minutes, go back to one of the things that brings you the most joy in ministry at the end of the workday. Now, that's not going to take away the bad day when you had to do stuff totally outside of your strengths all day. But doing that as a daily practice every day in, day out, week in, week out, we're finding makes an enormous difference to preventing burnout and promoting flourishing, just to stay in touch with the joy. So for example, a friend of mine loves hospital visitation. COVID was really hard for him because he couldn't do it as much, right, with the restrictions. But now that those are lifted, he will wait typically to the end of the day to do hospital visits on his way home from the office, because that's the thing he loves the most. And so no matter what happened that day, he's ending with something that's joy-giving, that's a part of why he felt called into this work to begin with, that kind of thing. So really important to stay in touch with the joy. Build a team around you. And then finally, I put develop financial literacy. It just comes up again and again and again in the clergy stress research that financial stress is a big deal. And it's not just not making a ton of money doing this kind of work. That's part of it. And there's not enough money to meet needs, to meet bills, et cetera. It really seems to be more around the lack of financial literacy, meaning, rarely do seminaries give any training whatsoever in financial management of any kind, personal finances or church finances, and then all of a sudden you got to be running a nonprofit essentially and managing a budget and all of that. And so if we're able to gain some skills, and there are places you can go to get training that give you basic skills in how to manage money well, your own money as well as church finances, then we have more of a sense of self-efficacy or mastery in that area, which doesn't take away but reduces the stress associated with money. Does that make sense? Because I know more what to do with whatever money I do have, even if it's not a ton of money. And so I can reduces the stress with that. So invest in that if that's an area where you feel like you haven't had enough equipping, which is very frequently the case. There also are organizations that will meet with clergy for free to do personal financial planning. So Thrivent, if you're not familiar with them, encourage you to look into Thrivent. They will do that for you. There are other organizations that will help you think about long-range financial planning, retirement, paying for college, that sort of stuff, which often people in our line of work don't do, but then they get to retirement and wish that they had been more intentional about that. Hear that all the time. So I encourage you to do that. That is our model of flourishing. Comments, questions about authenticity or this whole model? I'll just close with this story. Growing up in Nashville, I had the same senior pastor from early childhood all the way through college. His name was Millard Reed. Millard, what a first name. Had crazy eyebrows too that were always like, if your eyebrow was ever off in the youth group, you say you have a Millard, you need to fix your Millard. And he baptized me as a kid. He preached a sermon on the call to ministry when I was 12, where the Lord met me in a very powerful way. And that started a journey toward my pastoral identity from that age on. He checked back with me and nurtured that in me over the years. He showed up in the hospital when I had a life-threatening illness at the age of 10. He was there. He was there at my high school graduation, my college graduation. When my grandfather died, the pastor, he showed up at our house, and I'll never forget this. My dad opened the door, and Pastor Reed was there, and all he said was, "I'm here to grieve with you." And that's just about all he said. And then he was that ministry of presence in that moment that you are for so many people. He showed up at the hospital the morning my dad was to have open heart surgery. This was like 20 years ago. I flew an all-nighter from LA to get back to Nashville to get there before my dad went into surgery. I got there at like 7 in the morning. And who had been there since 6 a.m. reading Psalms to my dad but Pastor Reed. I sat and listened to his funeral a couple of years ago and was weeping with gratitude to God for this man who was so important to me. He was my pastor. you are that person for somebody, for some buddies. You may not hear about it often enough, but you cannot underestimate the way God is using you, even now, in ways you don't even see or realize, and may not even know till eternity. Amen. So may the Lord bless you. If I can be of support to you, you'll see in the slides here. I'll send all this. There's a free phone app. It takes about 20 minutes to complete a questionnaire. It gives you a personalized profile on your own well-being in these 4 areas, and then we'll suggest practices to you based on your profile. So if you're low in resilience, it'll say, hey, think about these practices, that kind of thing. It's interactive. And I'll send you those instructions. We also have started out of the center at APU a Flourishing in Ministry coaching initiative that's grant funded. So I have about 40 certified Flourishing in Ministry coaches who are also all certified by the International Coaching Federation, which is kind of the global standard for leadership coaching, if you're not familiar. So it's all based on this research and ICF core coaching competencies. So if you would like a coach to journey with you and think with you about your own holistic formation and well-being in English or Spanish, or Korean, actually, let me know. We also now have launched a coaching certification that's also ICF accredited. So if you'd like to become a coach, we have a cohort starting in the fall. It's an 80-hour training, 2 hours online a week of synchronous training, 3 or 4 hours of asynchronous work, watching videos, some reading, that kind of stuff. And then you come out of that ready to be certified by ICF as well. So if you're interested in any of that, let me know, and I'll send all this, Charlie, to you. You can send it on. But could I pray, and then would you come and lead us here as we close? Let me pray for us. God, thank you for this time. God, thank you for stirring things in our hearts and minds. God, would you call us into practices that would help us experience more of what you have for us, to position ourselves and posture ourselves to receive from you for the sake of your kingdom, for the sake of your work in the world. God, we believe it's your church and pray your will be done, your kingdom come. God, thank you for the privilege of joining with you in ministry, and I just pray for strength and for a new sense of your sustaining grace, God, for everyone here. Thank you for this time together, and as we worship you, God, as a close, may that be a benediction for us to be sent back into our context, God, in Jesus' name. And it's in that name that we pray. Amen.
Just to add on what Chris was sharing with the whole coaching portion, so this, we believed, and honestly it was a bit of a step of faith for me and Charlie, because we didn't know Chris very well coming into this, nor did we know Center for Vocational Ministry, but we read great things about it. And we just really, I think, believed in faith that this was kind of the start of a beautiful relationship. And what I mean by that is just an opportunity as Manna. Many of you kind of heard the vision that Manna, we're continuing with the Mercy and Justice grants, we're continuing to serve pastors. But one of the things that we believe deeply in, because of our past experience in church planting and even failed church planting, is the need for sustainable ministry, the need for sustainable churches and church plants and sustainable pastors, pastoral rhythms. And so we really believe that this retreat was just kind of the starting point for a relationship with Chris and what their organization is doing. And so as one of the sustainable platforms, and we've kind of narrowed it down, as you guys that heard Mark DeMoss came, one of them is going to be economic sustainability, and we're going to have a cohort with that that Manna is going to sponsor, so that pastors that want to be a part of that can go through that for free. But one of the other things too is that we want to work with an organization like this so that Manna can help pastors and sponsor them or whatever they need to get the coaching that they need. And our hope is too that eventually, even within Manna, there will be pastors that will say, hey, we want to coach. We want to coach pastors as well. And that's going to take time. But in the meantime, just having a relationship, partnership, they're already doing it. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. They're doing a great job. We can just come alongside and serve by what they're doing. So just to reemphasize what Chris said, if you feel like you need coaching, please reach out to us, reach out to Charlie, and we're going to put something together with them. I don't know entirely how it's all going to look, but it'll be specific to you guys. So yeah, please reach out to us for that. And the other thing I'll share too, just from some vision casting, I'm like so encouraged. Chris was sharing that 5 to 7 years. I don't know if you caught that, Charlie. It was the trajectory, like within the first 5 to 7 years, what pastors do, it's very much going to establish them for their career. And I just step back and look at Manna because I know it's what God's doing. And I just say, God, you're so good. Because ultimately that very much is our heart. Manna is the first 5 to 7 years of ministry, or what we call seedling churches.
Wow.
And that we want to have an impact on those pastors in the first 5 to 7 years, because we believe that if we do, that we will see longevity.
You will.
That we can see these pastors go for years and decades even, and be spiritual parents and spiritual grandparents, not only to individuals but also to churches, future church plants. And so I heard that and I was just like, oh God, you're so good. And it just impresses upon me all the more that what we're doing with Manna is vital. It's vital for Southern California Kingdom. And so even with that, just to share a little bit of vision as it relates to the sustainable platforms, one of the things that we're working at towards too is, as you talked about, backstage. But that as we have these sustainable platforms that are built out, whether it's economic sustainability or pastoral rhythm in a sustainable way, we realize that we need a vehicle, so to speak, a connection to these pastors to help them understand where they need to grow in. And so our heart and hope is to raise up what we would call, whether we're kind of working on the name, whether it's coaching or whatever it is that can come along, young pastors especially, and just be there for them. Now, some of you already have those in your life and you don't need it, but we meet so many pastors that don't. And so if we can put coaches into their life, and maybe it's 1-on-2, 1-on-1, 1-on-3, whatever, but small group where you as a young pastor can meet with this person. Maybe they have a little more wisdom, experience, maybe they have some gray hairs, but just somebody that would just see you for you and encourage you and strengthen you, and that you'd be able to be vulnerable with and really share with, and that they can just be there to strengthen and encourage you, and then help you along the way and say, hey, I think maybe you're lacking in this area. Can I get you some help or whatnot? And so really to have that person kind of outside of those closest to you, maybe outside of your bubble, that can kind of see things that maybe you miss in your blind sides and stuff. So that's something we're working towards as well, of raising those people up. And that's different than what Chris is doing here as far as coaching, but it would just be somebody that would be there for you, to get together with you once a month. So please be praying for us in that. We, definitely have some thoughts on pastors and different people that I think would suit this very well. But yeah, just pray for us as we do that, because, with Manna, where we're at right now, we have about 40 churches that we're connected with, and so kind of multiplying that out and understanding that maybe half of them don't have that person in their life, that's going to be a significant number of coaches that we need to raise up into those positions. So anyway, I want to just share some vision with that, and I love it how the Holy Spirit's kind of moving in similar directions with what you guys are doing and what God's called us to. So
Thanks be to God.
all that being said, though, thank you guys so much for coming up. Christian's going to lead us in a couple of songs, and then after that,